Now, if we move on to diffuse sources of P, that's just a classic situation, common sight that you see of erosion in the hill country. Basic point here, I talked about the solubility of the main form on which the nitrogen appears is the problem, which is nitrates. The phosphorus equivalents are much less soluble. So basically think about the P compounds, the P forms are much less soluble than the N. So phosphorus does not get into water bodies by travelling through groundwater. It comes in with the sediment, and it also can come in when you get flood events and you get fertiliser and dung washed in. But this is of course just the diffuse sources of P, and we'll see in a moment that the point sources of P are very significant as well. I understand that New Zealand soils generally are low in phosphorus, but if you get a lot of sediment going and even carrying a low concentration, you can still get quite a lot. There's estimated that 500 tonnes of phosphorus a year goes down the upper Manawatu River attached to the eroded soil. So I wanted to get this picture of the nitrogen, the N, sort of leaking through into the groundwater and finding its way through, very soluble, whereas the P has to mechanically be transferred in lumps of soil. So looking at the diffuse sources of P, the same thing, per hectare every year. Forest again is low, sheep and beef. Now that's interesting. See, dairy is actually lower per hectare for phosphate than sheep and beef with average. So you're getting more from a hectare of sheep or beef than you are from dairy on average. And that is because sheep farms, a lot of them are in steeper country with cleared hills, and so you're getting more erosion. Whereas on dairy farms, you're not getting that same effect. Now, I just want to move on, and whoops, I forgot to put horticulture and cropping in, which is the highest by a long way, but again, relatively small area. The recipe for algae, how do we get algae? How do we make it? Well, we make it with, first of all, we need photosynthesis, because it's a plant, and so it needs carbon dioxide and sun to grow, and then we need some nitrogen, and then we need some phosphorus. And that's actually important to understand, that you need both nitrogen and phosphorus. One or the other won't do it. You actually need both. Okay, another very important fact, lakes are more vulnerable than rivers, and there's Lake Rotorua, which is in a pretty bad state. Hard to imagine being able to get that back to a good state, really. Taupo, and as you will well know, there's money in the budget this year to try and address those two lakes, because they're, you know, iconic lakes. But here's a really bad one, Horowhenua. That's the sign up beside it. Very simply, lakes are more vulnerable to degradation, more vulnerable to growing algae, because they don't get flushed like rivers do. And rivers get flushed and pollutants get carried out to sea. But also importantly, some rivers are much more vulnerable than others. So you can put the same kind of pollutants in one river and it might be relatively harmless. In another river, it might do some serious damage. And it's important to understand how that works. So here's the Haast River, which is naturally quite resistant to damage being done to it, because there's lots of water, it's fast flowing, it's shaded, if you're not getting the sunlight in, it's cold. So this is, you know, shade and cold and lots of water, so it's fast flowing, so you're not getting the concentrations building up. This is not a good place to try and grow algae, even if you wanted to. In contrast, the Manawatu, wide, slow, shallow, warm, meandering, completely open to the sunlight. So basically, a river like that is naturally much more vulnerable to the effects of the pollutants coming in than a river like the Haast. But then to add, of course, to it, the Haast is forested, the Manawatu is not. It's in a developed catchment, both with urban effects and agricultural effects. Another thing that's important to understand, I haven't got any pictures illustrating this, but even among developed catchments, there's a lot of variation. For instance, if you go to Taranaki, you'll see a lot of the streams there that flow down from the mountain to the sea are very deeply incised. And what the effect of that is that in summer, and a lot of them are now getting riparian strips, and it's a very good job being done there with that, they're much more shaded in summer than a wide open river, and so the algae aren't getting the sunlight that they need to photosynthesize and grow. And as well as that, a lot of those are fairly fast flowing with high rainfall on the mountains. So they're not, even though it's a highly developed catchment, they're not as vulnerable. It's not so easy to grow algae and cause problems with them. So the Manawatu, though, has been labelled loosely, recently, a lot in the media as the worst river in the world. So I want to move on to the next part of my talk and think, is this true? What were all those headlines based on? You know, what was actually going on behind the scenes? I think that's useful to understand. You notice that it started to come out over time that in fact had been somewhat exaggerated. But what was going on here was the Cawthron Institute in Nelson, a new way of measuring river health was developed, and I mentioned earlier that a healthy river is a river with lots of oxygen dissolved in it. And what this method did, it's not measuring N and P and sediment and those things directly. What it does is measure the changes in the dissolved oxygen over the 24-hour period, you see. So you're getting that kind of more integrated measure of river health. Now, one of those measurements that was taken was actually 107, never mind about the units, 107. Anything above 7 is considered unhealthy. So really measuring 107, truly alarming. And this was the highest figure that had been recorded to date using that method, and it was the worst of 300 rivers that had been measured at that time using this method. But before I go back to that, let's just have a bit of a look at the Manawatu. We're quite proud of the slide. It took a bit of effort to produce. All right, here we go. Point sources: Norsewood, sewage, Dannevirke, Woodville, Eketahuna, Pahiatua, Ashurst, Akotari, Palmerston North, Longburn, Fielding, Awahuri, Shannon and Foxton. And then, I think that's all the towns. Then we've got 2 Fonterra plants there. We've got the Tui Brewery, Mangatinoka, and we've got freezing works, and we've got New Zealand Pharmaceuticals. So that's an awful lot of point sources. And of course the sewage in most cases is treated, but often to not a very good level. All right, so how well your sewage is treated, it depends how much money you spend on it really. And of course when you've got lots of small towns, that's a considerable problem. And so in terms of non-point sources, the light, obviously the dark green there are the ranges, the light green is sheep and beef, and then there's a lot of dairying in that area historically, and of course more development lately. So that's the poor old Manawatu really. Now let's just have a look at the 107, this measurement of 107. So I want to make the point that river health varies with where you measure it on the river. So there's the 107 that was measured at Opiki on the Manawatu, and there's a couple of other measurements above the gorge and Palmerston North. The red line, by the way, is 7, the level that's considered to be healthy. The Mangatinoka there and the Rangatiki is actually in pretty good shape, sitting under the 7. But that was, those measurements were all taken at the same time. Now, I want to just concentrate on those two that I put circles around for my next slide, measuring the Manawatu above the gorge and at Palmerston North.